The polished mahogany of the courtroom felt more like a coffin than a place of justice. A ruthless corporate lawyer smirked. The judge raised his gavel to destroy a family, and a desperate mother wept, bracing for total ruin. They didn't even look at her 17-year-old son sitting in the gallery. They saw an urban kid in a faded hoodie. They didn't know they were looking at a legal prodigy about to rip their airtight case to shreds. Cook County Circuit Court smelled of stale floor wax, cheap coffee, and desperation. It was a room where lives were quietly dismantled on a daily basis, processed through a bureaucratic meat grinder that favored the wealthy and crushed the uninformed. At the defendant's table sat Elena Whitaker. She was 42 but looked 10 years older, her eyes hollowed out from back-to-back double shifts at Memorial Hospital. She wore her only good dress, a navy blue polyester number that she had meticulously ironed the night before, trying to project the dignity she felt slipping through her fingers. Her hands, calloused and raw from years of scrubbing during nursing rounds, trembled as they rested on a scarred oak table. Beside her sat Victor Hayes, a public defender who looked like he had given up on his career a decade ago. Hayes was sweating through his inexpensive gray suit, shuffling a stack of disorganized manila folders, and occasionally sighing heavily. He hadn't even looked Elena in the eye since they sat down. To him, she was just another inevitable loss, another poor woman about to be steamrolled by the system. Across the aisle, occupying the plaintiff's table like a conquering king, was Garrett Harrington. Harrington was a senior partner at a boutique corporate law firm that specialized in asset extraction and predatory debt enforcement. His suit cost more than Elena made in months. His hair was impeccably styled, his posture relaxed, and his smile carried the sharp predatory edge of a man who knew he held all the cards. He represented Apex Holdings, a faceless real estate company that had purchased the house Elena Whitaker lived in. The presiding authority over this tragic case was Judge Vivian Hargrove. Judge Hargrove was a woman whose late 60s had been marked by impatience and strict adherence to procedure and law. She had a distinct lack of sympathy for people who broke the law. She looked down from her elevated bench at the trembling figure of Elena Whitaker. Her face was set in an angry stare. "Mr. Hayes?" Judge Hargrove's voice was clean, sharp, and grating. "Are we nearly finished here? I have 4 more hearings before lunch. This case seems overwhelmingly straightforward. Your client signed the addendum. The balloon payment came due. She defaulted. Apex Holdings has filed for immediate repossession of the property to cover the debt plus legal fees. What exactly is your defense, counsel?" Victor Hayes stood up, wiping his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief. He looked at his notes, swallowed hard, and offered a defense so weak it was practically an insult. "Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Whitaker. She was unaware of the addendum. Her late husband signed the original mortgage agreement. The addendum in question was buried in a lengthy refinancing document. She is a widow, Your Honor, a nurse. She simply doesn't have the funds to satisfy this immediate demand. We are asking the court for leniency and a restructuring of the debt." Garrett Harrington chuckled softly, a sound that cut through the silent room like a razor. He stood up slowly, buttoning his tailored jacket. "Leniency, Your Honor?" Harrington asked, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. "While my heart certainly bleeds for Mrs. Whitaker's personal tragedies, this is a court of law, not a charity foundation. The contract is binding. The signature of her late husband is verified. As the inheritor of the estate, she assumes the debt. Ignorance of the clauses within a legally binding document does not invalidate the document itself. Apex Holdings has been more than patient. We demand immediate summary judgment. The house is collateral. The law is absolute." "Oi!" Elena let out a small, strangled sob, covering her mouth with both hands. The house wasn't just a piece of property. It was the only thing she had left of her husband, who had died of a sudden aneurysm years earlier. It was the home where she had raised her son. Losing it meant immediate homelessness. They had no savings. The hospital barely paid her enough to cover groceries and utilities. If the judge ruled in favor of Apex Holdings, the sheriff's department would have them on the street by the next morning. Judge Hargrove sighed, adjusting her glasses. She looked down at Hayes. Mr. Harrington is correct. The court cannot rewrite a contract simply because it poses a financial hardship to the defendant. Does the defense have any actual legal standing to challenge the validity of the contract? Any misrepresentation? Any procedural anomalies? Hayes looked down at his messy files. He flipped a page, then another. A silence in the room stretched out, agonizingly. Finally, Hayes shook his head, looking utterly defeated. "No, Your Honor. We have no further arguments." Elena felt the room tilt. The edges of her vision darkened. She looked at Hayes in sheer disbelief. That was it. That was the extent of her defense. A few minutes of stammering, and now her life was over. "Very well," Judge Hargrove said, picking up her wooden gavel. "Having heard the arguments and seeing no legal reason to invalidate the claims of the plaintiff, I am prepared to rule in favor of—" "Wait." The voice didn't come from the defense table. It didn't come from the plaintiff's table. It came from the gallery directly behind the wooden railing that separated the spectators from the legal arena. It was a young voice, steady, calm, but carrying a resonance that demanded immediate attention. Judge Hargrove froze, her gavel hovering an inch above the sounding block. She snapped her head up, her eyes narrowing in fury at the interruption. Garrett Harrington turned around, raising an aristocratic eyebrow in amusement. Elena gasped, twisting in her chair. Sitting in the front row of the gallery was Elias Whitaker. Elias Whitaker was 17 years old. He was a high school senior, slightly lanky, dressed in a faded black hoodie, dark jeans, and scuffed sneakers. To the bailiff standing by the door, to the judge on the bench, and to the expensive lawyer across the room, Elias looked exactly like what their biases told them. He was a statistic. Just another inner-city kid sitting in the back of a courtroom, completely out of his depth. They couldn't have been more wrong. Elias had not spent the years since his father's death grieving by acting out or shutting down. While Elena worked double shifts, Elias took over the house. He cooked, he cleaned, and he studied. But Elias's brain didn't work like a normal teenager's. From a very young age, his teachers had realized he possessed an eidetic memory, a photographic recall so precise it was almost frightening. But it wasn't just memory. It was the way he synthesized information. He saw patterns where others saw chaos. He understood systems, logic, and structure. When the letters from Apex Holdings started arriving, demanding exorbitant payments and threatening foreclosure, Elena had tried to hide them from him to protect him. But Elias had found them in the bottom of her nursing tote. He didn't panic. He went to work. Every day after school, while other kids played sports or hung out at the mall, Elias took the city bus down to the Central Public Library. He bypassed the young adult section and went straight to the legal archives. Since they couldn't afford a lawyer, Elias had decided he would figure it out himself. For months he read. He devoured introductory law textbooks, moved on to the Uniform Commercial Code, studied Illinois state property laws, and pored over decades of appellate court decisions. He learned the language of the enemy. He learned about torts, breach of contract, statute of frauds, and civil procedure. He would sit under the flickering fluorescent lights until the librarian kicked him out at closing time, his notebooks filled with dense, meticulously cross-referenced citations. Elias had begged his mother to let him help her build the case, but Elena had insisted on trusting the system. She believed the court-appointed lawyer would know what to do. She wanted Elias to focus on his studies, not her financial nightmares. So Elias had sat in the gallery that day, silently praying that Victor Hayes actually knew what he was doing. For the last stretch of time, Elias had watched in mounting horror as Hayes spectacularly failed to deploy even basic legal defense strategies. Hayes hadn't checked the notarization stamps. He hadn't questioned the chain of title on the debt transfer. He was simply rolling over. As Elias sat there watching the judge raise the gavel, his mind was racing. He saw the structure of Garrett Harrington's argument. It was a beautiful, ruthless piece of legal engineering, but like any machine, it had a flaw. Elias had found that flaw recently while reading a dusty volume of property law on his cracked laptop. He knew that if that gavel fell, it was over. Summary judgments were notoriously difficult to appeal, especially without money. If he let the system run its course, his mother would lose everything. So he didn't let the system run its course. "Wait," Elias said again, louder this time. He stood up from the wooden bench. Judge Hargrove's face turned a deep, mottled red. This courtroom was her domain. Interruptions from the gallery were an unforgivable blasphemy. "Who is speaking?" Hargrove thundered. "Bailiff, remove that young man from my courtroom immediately. This is not a town hall meeting." Bailiff Walter, a burly man with a thick mustache, started walking down the aisle toward Elias, resting his hand on his utility belt. "Come on, kid, let's go. Outside." Elena stood up, panicked. "No, please, that's my son. Please, Your Honor. He's just a boy. He doesn't know anything." "He is disrupting a legal proceeding," Judge Hargrove snapped. "Mrs. Whitaker, I can hold him in contempt of court and put him in a holding cell if I choose to. Bailiff, remove him now." Elias didn't step back. He didn't run. He didn't show an ounce of fear. He looked right past the approaching bailiff, locked eyes with the judge, and spoke in a slow, calm, and authoritative voice. "Your Honor, under the Illinois Code of Civil Procedure, Section 2-408, I have the right to intervene in this action. As a resident of the property in question and a direct dependent of the defendant, the outcome of this summary judgment materially and directly affects my living status. Furthermore, the defense counsel has failed to introduce a critical piece of exculpatory evidence regarding the plaintiff's standing to sue." The entire courtroom went dead silent. The stenographer's fingers stopped typing. Hayes's jaw practically hit the table. Garrett Harrington stopped his smug chuckling, his eyes narrowing as he reevaluated the teenager in the hoodie. Judge Hargrove stared at the boy, completely taken aback. Teenagers from this neighborhood were supposed to mumble, "Look down," and show intimidation in the face of authority. They were not supposed to perfectly recite civil procedure codes from memory. "Are you attempting to represent your mother, young man?" Judge Hargrove asked, her tone shifting from pure rage to a dangerous, mocking incredulity. "You are a minor. You haven't passed the bar. You aren't even old enough to buy a lottery ticket, let alone practice law in my courtroom." "I'm not attempting to act as primary counsel, Your Honor," Elias replied smoothly, stepping out from the pew and walking right up to the wooden railing that divided the gallery from the court floor. "I am invoking my right as an interested party to provide amicus curiae, a friend of the court, as the defense counsel, Mr. Hayes, seems to have overlooked a fundamental jurisdictional defect in Mr. Harrington's filing." Victor Hayes turned beet red. "Now see here, kid." "Quiet, Mr. Hayes," Judge Hargrove said, holding up a hand. The judge leaned forward, crossing her arms. She was a woman who enjoyed a spectacle, and she was absolutely certain this arrogant kid was about to make a fool of himself. It would be highly entertaining to watch Garrett Harrington tear the boy to pieces. "Well now, a legal scholar in a hoodie," Hargrove drawled. "Mr. Harrington, do you have any objection to allowing the defendant's son to approach the bench and offer his amateur legal theory before I rule?" Garrett Harrington smiled a slick, oily grin. He looked at Elias like a lion looks at a wounded gazelle. "No objection at all, Your Honor. I think it would be highly educational for the young man to learn a practical lesson about how the real world works. Please let the boy speak. I could use the entertainment." "Very well," Hargrove said, waving her hand. "Come forward, young man. Let's hear your brilliant legal insight. But be warned. If you waste the court's time, I will not hesitate to hold you in contempt." Elias pushed open the swinging wooden gate and crossed the threshold into the legal arena. He walked past Garrett Harrington, ignoring the lawyer's mocking smirk, and approached the defense table. He placed a gentle hand on his mother's shoulder. Elena was shaking violently, tears streaming down her face. "Elias, what are you doing?" she whispered frantically. "Please, just sit down. They're going to put you in jail." "Trust me, Mom," Elias whispered back, his voice incredibly soft but ironclad with confidence. "I've got this. I promise." He turned to Victor Hayes, who was glaring at him angrily. "Give me the addendum," Elias said, holding out his hand. "Listen to me, you little punk," Hayes hissed under his breath. "You are embarrassing me, and you are making things worse for your mother. Sit down before—" "Give me the addendum, Mr. Hayes," Elias interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a chilling authority. or I will inform the judge that you failed to request the original wet ink signature during discovery, which is grounds for an immediate malpractice complaint to the state bar." Hayes blinked, stunned. His hands fumbled as he pulled a stapled packet of paper from his chaotic file and handed it to the boy. Elias took the document and walked to the center of the floor, standing exactly halfway between the judge's bench and the opposing counsel's table. He didn't look like a scared teenager anymore. He stood with his back straight, his shoulders squared. He held the document in one hand. "Whenever you are ready, Mr. Whitaker," Judge Hargrove drawled sarcastically. "The court waits with bated breath." "Thank you, Your Honor," Elias began, his voice ringing clear across the silent room. "Mr. Harrington has built his entire motion for summary judgment on the premise that my late father signed this addendum, which introduced a balloon payment clause into our original mortgage agreement. Because my father passed away, Mr. Harrington claims the debt transferred to my mother, and due to her inability to pay, Apex Holdings has the right to foreclose." "A very good summary of the facts, kid," Harrington interrupted condescendingly. "See, Your Honor? Even a high schooler can understand it. The contract is binding." "It would be binding," Elias countered, smoothly pivoting on his heel to face Harrington directly, "if it were actually a legal contract. But it isn't. It's a piece of trash." The court gasped. Judge Hargrove slammed her gavel down twice. "Watch your tone, young man. You are in a court of law, not a playground." "I apologize for the colloquialism, Your Honor," Elias said without missing a beat. "Allow me to rephrase in legal terms. The document Mr. Harrington is presenting to this court is entirely void under the Illinois statute of frauds, and his motion for summary judgment is based on a fraudulent premise." Harrington scoffed loudly, throwing his hands up. "Fraudulent, Your Honor? This is absurd. The signature has been authenticated." "The signature of my father is authentic," Elias agreed. "But the dates are not, and the notary stamp is not." Elias walked toward the bench, holding up the documents. "If the court will direct its attention to the clause detailing the balloon payment. Below that is the signature line. My father's signature is dated a certain day. Next to it is the notary public stamp verifying the signature. The notary's commission expiration date is listed as a date that had already passed by the time of signing." "So what?" Harrington snapped, losing a fraction of his smugness. "The notary was commissioned at the time of the signing. That makes it perfectly legal." "Actually, it doesn't," Elias said, a cold, razor-sharp smile finally touching his lips. It was the smile of a chess grandmaster who had just cornered the king. "Because I didn't just read the contract, Mr. Harrington. I read the metadata of the property records filed with the county clerk." Elias reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. He unfolded it and handed it to the bailiff, gesturing for him to pass it to the judge. "What I just handed the court," Elias explained, pacing slowly in front of the plaintiff's table, "is a certified record from the Illinois Secretary of State's notary public database. It shows that the notary who stamped this document, a Mr. Gerald Thompson, had his notary license suspended weeks prior due to ethical violations regarding backdated real estate documents." The air in the room seemed to freeze. Harrington's face went completely pale. "Let me be absolutely clear," Elias continued, his voice rising, filling every corner of the room with undeniable authority. "My father signed this document on a certain date. The notary, Gerald Thompson, stamped it on that same date, but Thompson had his license stripped weeks prior. Under Illinois state law, specifically the precedent of Brentwood versus Carter, any real estate contract altering the primary terms of a mortgage that is verified by an unlicensed or suspended notary is not just voidable, it is void ab initio. From the beginning, it is legally non-existent." Elias stopped pacing and stared directly into Garrett Harrington's shocked eyes. "My father never agreed to a legal balloon payment because the document executing it is mathematically and legally impossible to uphold. Apex Holdings bought a fraudulent debt, and you, Mr. Harrington, just attempted to enforce a voided contract in a court of law to steal my mother's house." Judge Hargrove was staring at the paper the bailiff had handed him. His eyes darted rapidly across the text. He looked at the date of the notary's suspension. He looked at the date on the contract. "Mr. Harrington," Judge Hargrove's voice was suddenly very quiet, stripped of all its previous sarcasm. It was the voice of a judge realizing his court had almost been used to commit a felony. "Are you aware of this discrepancy?" Harrington stood up, his slick composure shattering. He fumbled with his briefcase. "Your Honor, our firm processes thousands of these documents. We rely on third-party verification. If there is an issue with the notary, we were unaware." "Ignorance of the law is no excuse, Mr. Harrington," Elias fired back, weaponizing the exact phrase the lawyer had used earlier. Rule 11 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, which is mirrored in Illinois courts, mandates that an attorney must conduct a reasonable inquiry into the factual basis of a document before presenting it to the court. You didn't do your due diligence. You just saw a poor widow and thought you could push her over. Elena Whitaker was staring at her son as if she had never seen him before. Victor Hayes was furiously taking notes, realizing this teenager was doing his job better than he had in years. "Your Honor," Elias said, turning back to the judge, his posture unwavering, "based on the undeniable fact that the contract addendum is legally void, I ask that the plaintiff's motion for summary judgment be immediately dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, I request that the court recognize the original mortgage terms, which my mother is entirely up to date on, as the only valid standing agreement." Judge Hargrove slowly lowered the document. She looked at Garrett Harrington, who was currently sweating profusely, looking like a man who had just stepped on a landmine. Then the judge looked at Elias. The irritation and mockery were completely gone from the old woman's face, replaced by a profound, grudging respect. "Mr. Harrington," Hargrove said, her voice dripping with ice, "do you have any counter-argument to the very specific and heavily documented claim this young man just made?" Harrington swallowed hard, his expensive suit suddenly looking very heavy. He looked at the judge, then at the teenager who had just humiliated him. "No, Your Honor. The plaintiff requests a recess to review the new evidence." "Request denied," Hargrove barked, slamming her gavel down. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "This court does not need a recess to recognize a fraudulent document. Case dismissed with prejudice. Apex Holdings is barred from pursuing this specific debt further. And Mr. Harrington, you can expect a formal inquiry from this bench regarding your firm's document verification practices. Do I make myself clear?" "Crystal, Your Honor," Harrington muttered, hastily packing his briefcase. Elena burst into tears again, but this time they were tears of overwhelming relief and joy. She stood up and wrapped her arms around Elias, burying her face in his shoulder. Elias hugged her back tightly, closing his eyes as the immense pressure of the last months finally lifted off his shoulders. But as Elias opened his eyes and looked across the courtroom, he noticed Garrett Harrington wasn't leaving. The lawyer had stopped at the swinging gate. He was staring at Elias, his eyes narrowed, calculating something. And up on the bench, Judge Hargrove was also watching the boy. Elias had just saved his home. He had beaten a corporate titan using nothing but a library card and an eidetic memory. But as he looked at the hardened expressions of the men in power around him, Elias realized something terrifying. This wasn't over. He hadn't just won a case. He had exposed a massive multi-million-dollar vulnerability in Apex Holdings' entire business model. If Gerald Thompson had stamped this fraudulent contract, how many hundreds of other families had Apex Holdings evicted using the exact same legal loophole Elias had just pointed out to the court? And the Hornets were about to strike back. The euphoria of the courtroom victory lasted only a short time. Back in their small two-bedroom bungalow on the south side, Elena Whitaker was in the kitchen humming a gospel tune for the first time in years. She was frying chicken and boiling collard greens, using the last of her grocery budget to celebrate the miracle of her son. She kept glancing into the living room, looking at her son as if he were a stranger who had suddenly sprouted wings. But Elias wasn't celebrating. He sat cross-legged on the warm living room rug, his cracked laptop burning hot against his thighs. The glow of the screen illuminated the intense, unblinking focus in his eyes. While his mother saw a closed chapter, Elias saw the edge of a massive, terrifying puzzle. His eidetic memory was a blessing, but it was also a curse. His brain refused to let go of incomplete data. Why would a massive conglomerate like Apex Holdings rely on a suspended notary? It wasn't a clerical error. Harrington's firm processed thousands of foreclosures. They had compliance departments. You don't make a mistake like that by accident. You do it on purpose because the notary is cheap and complicit. Elias's fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the public-facing county clerk sites and digging deep into the Illinois Digital Property Archive. He ran a Boolean search cross-referencing the name Gerald Thompson with Apex Holdings and the addendum. The loading icon spun for a few agonizing seconds. Then the results populated. Elias's breath hitched in his throat. There were hundreds of properties across Cook County, predominantly in lower-income minority neighborhoods, where Apex Holdings had executed balloon payment addendums, verified by Gerald Thompson after his license had been suspended. Hundreds of families who had been illegally evicted. Hundreds of homes stolen through a systematic, institutionalized foreclosure pipeline. "Dinner's almost ready, baby," Elena called out from the kitchen, her voice light and musical. "I still can't believe it. I keep waiting for the sheriff to knock on the door. But we're safe, Elias. We're actually safe." Before Elias could answer, a heavy rhythmic knock echoed through the house. Not from the kitchen door, from the front door. Elena's humming stopped instantly. The sound of sizzling oil seemed to magnify in the sudden suffocating silence. Elias closed his laptop. He stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs, and walked to the front window. He pulled the frayed curtain back just a fraction of an inch. Parked on the street, gleaming under the broken streetlight, was a black luxury sedan. Standing on their porch were two men. One was Garrett Harrington, the lawyer he had humiliated hours earlier. He was no longer wearing his courtroom suit. He wore a dark cashmere overcoat. The man next to him was built like a cinder block, wearing a tailored suit that barely hid the bulge of a shoulder holster. "Elias," Elena whispered, wiping her hands on her apron as she stepped into the living room. "Who is it?" "Go into the kitchen," Elias said quietly. "Don't come out." "Elias, call the police." "No, we haven't done anything illegal yet." Elias knew what would happen if they kicked the door open. He could see the gun. He stared through the small gap at the man on his porch. "Good evening, Elias," Harrington said, his voice smooth, devoid of any emotion or threat. "May we come in?" "No," Elias said quietly. Harrington smiled at the public. "I understand. I'd be defensive too. But I'm not here to threaten you, son. I'm here to offer you a scholarship." Elias didn't move. Harrington reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope, and slid it through the crack in the door. It fell onto the welcome mat. "Inside that envelope," Harrington said, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial murmur, "is a cashier's check made out to Elena Whitaker for a substantial sum, tax-free. It's a settlement offer." Elias looked down at the envelope. $250,000. It was more money than his mother would make in a decade. It would pay for his college. It would fix the leaking roof. It would change their lives. "A settlement for what?" Elias asked, his voice steady. "The judge dismissed the case. We don't owe you anything. It's not for the house, Elias. It's for your silence," Harrington said, leaning closer to the door, his eyes cold and dead. "You're a smart kid. A genius, frankly. The CEO of Apex Holdings, Richard Harlan, is very impressed. We know you're sitting in there right now, digging into the county records. We know you found the other Thompson files. You stumbled onto a plumbing leak in our corporate structure." "You mean a massive, coordinated fraud ring," Elias corrected. "Semantics." Harrington waved his hand dismissively. "The point is, nobody else knows about this. If you go to the press or try to file a class action, you will be locked in litigation for years. Apex has a war chest solely dedicated to crushing lawsuits. We will drag you through depositions until you graduate college. We will bury you in paperwork. And in the end, we will win because the system is designed for us to win." The large man next to Harrington shifted his weight, his presence a silent, looming threat. "Or," Harrington continued softly, "you take the envelope. You sign the attached non-disclosure agreement. You wipe your hard drive. Your mother retires tomorrow. You go to Harvard or Yale or wherever a kid with a brain like yours belongs. You win, Elias. You beat us. Take your prize and walk away." Elias looked at the envelope. He thought about the exhaustion in his mother's eyes. He thought about the double shifts. All he had to do was reach down, pick it up, and sign the paper. Then his eidetic memory flashed an image in his mind. It wasn't a good one. It was of an elderly woman who lived nearby. Apex Holdings had evicted her recently. She had died in a city shelter not long after. Hundreds of families. Elias looked up, his expression hardening into stone. $250,000, Harrington said slowly. "That's a lot of money. It's a new life." "Which means my math is right," Elias countered, a cold fire igniting in his chest. "If you're willing to write a check for that amount on a Friday night to a 17-year-old kid, it means your exposure is in the hundreds of millions. It means Richard Harlan is terrified." Harrington's smile vanished. "You're making a mistake, kid," Harrington warned, his voice dropping its friendly facade. "You got lucky today because you surprised me. You won't surprise us again. The people I work for do not like loose ends. If you don't take this envelope, you're going to learn how heavy the real world is." "Get off my porch," Elias said, "before I call the police and report 2 men trespassing." Harrington stared at him for a long, venomous moment. Then he reached down, picked up the envelope, and slipped it back into his coat. "I tried to do this the easy way," Harrington whispered. "Remember that when the roof caves in." The 2 men turned and walked back to the Mercedes. Elias shut the door, threw the deadbolt, and leaned against the wood, his chest heaving. He had just turned down a fortune. He had just declared war on a billion-dollar empire. "Elias?" Elena asked, coming out of the kitchen holding a wooden spoon like a weapon. "Who was that?" Elias looked at his mother, realizing he could no longer fight this battle from the shadows. "Mom, we need a lawyer. A real one." Diane Montgomery did not look like a corporate giant slayer. Her office, located above a failing strip mall in downtown Chicago, smelled perpetually of stale coffee and printer toner. Her desk was an archaeological dig site of legal briefs, empty takeout containers, and half-empty bottles of antacids. Diane was in her 50s, possessed a head of chaotic gray curls, and had spent the last 20 years fighting civil rights abuses and corporate malpractice. She was brilliant, cynical, and notoriously difficult to work with. When Elias walked into her office on a weekday afternoon, skipping his AP calculus class, Diane didn't even look up from her paperwork. "We don't do pro bono traffic, kid. Public defender's office is 3 blocks down," she muttered, highlighting a line of text. "I don't have a traffic ticket," Elias said, dropping a thick 3-ring binder onto the center of her desk. The sheer weight of it made her coffee cup rattle. "I have a systemic multi-million-dollar real estate fraud case against Apex Holdings and the law firm of Garrett Harrington. I've mapped the corporate structure, documented hundreds of illegal foreclosures, and identified specific penal codes they violated. I need you to serve as lead counsel for a class action lawsuit." Diane finally looked up, peering over her reading glasses at the teenager standing in front of her. She looked at his faded hoodie, his backpack, and then down at the meticulously tabbed binder. She let out a harsh bark of a laugh. "Is this a prank? Did the guys over at Legal Aid send you here to mess with me?" "Open the binder, Ms. Montgomery," Elias said, pulling up a chair and sitting down uninvited. "Page 1. My name is Elias Whitaker. Recently, I successfully defended my mother in pro se capacity against Garrett Harrington by proving their notary, Gerald Thompson, was operating under a suspended license. The judge dismissed with prejudice." Diane's amusement evaporated. She sat up straight. She knew Garrett Harrington. She hated Garrett Harrington. The man was a corporate vulture who had beaten her in court before. She pulled the binder toward her and flipped it open. Her eyes scanned the first page, then the second, then the third. The room went silent, except for the rustle of turning pages. She saw the metadata logs. She saw the cross-referenced property deeds. She saw a legal strategy laid out with a precision that bordered on the terrifying. "Who helped you build this?" Diane asked, her voice hushed, looking at Elias as if he were an alien. "What paralegal did this?" "I did," Elias said. "I have an eidetic memory. I memorized the state property codes, but I'm 17. I don't have standing to file a class action, and I don't have a law degree to argue it. I need a litigator with teeth. I read your brief on State versus Omnicorp. You're aggressive. You don't settle easily. You're the right fit for this." Diane took off her glasses, rubbing her temples. "Kid, do you have any idea what you're holding here? This isn't just civil liability. This is RICO territory. This is federal racketeering. If Apex Holdings knowingly used a fraudulent notary to process hundreds of evictions, this will destroy the company. It will send their CEO to federal prison." "I know," Elias said. "That's the point. They will crush you," Diane warned. "They won't play by the rules. They will find your leverage points, and they will snap them. You are a high school student. You are not ready for a blood match with a billion-dollar real estate conglomerate." "They already tried to buy me off," Elias said. "Harrington showed up at my house with a check for $250,000. I told him to go to hell." Diane stared, her jaw slightly unhinged, and slowly, a dangerous smile spread across her face. It was the smile of a seasoned fighter who had just been handed a loaded bazooka. "All right," Diane said, slamming the binder shut. "You want to slay a dragon. We're going to need to file an emergency injunction to freeze the remaining properties before they realize we're coming for them. We have to hit them fast and hard." They spent the next several hours locked in the office. Elias watched as Diane operated, marveling at her mind. While Elias had the raw data and the memorized statutes, Diane knew how the machine worked. She knew which judges to avoid, which clerks to press, and how to draft a class action complaint that would detonate like a bomb on the court docket. By evening, they had a lengthy filing ready for the federal courthouse. Elias felt a surge of adrenaline. They were going to do it. They were going to save hundreds of families. His phone vibrated in his pocket. It was his mother. "Hey, Mom," Elias answered, stepping out into the hallway. "I'm sorry I'm late. I'm at the library." "Elias." Elena's voice was barely a whisper. It was a choked, broken sound that made the blood freeze in his veins. "Mom, what's wrong? Are you okay?" They fired me, Elias. The hospital." Elias gripped the phone, his knuckles turning white. "What? Why? You've been there for years." "Security called me into the office at the end of my shift," Elena sobbed, completely falling apart. "They searched my locker. They found bottles of oxycodone hidden in my nursing shoes. Elias, I swear to God I didn't put them there. I don't even have access to that cabinet. But the director of nursing said they have an anonymous tip. They suspended my license. The police are investigating me for felony theft." Elias felt the floor drop out from beneath him. "They will find your leverage points, and they will snap them." Diane's words echoed in his head. "Mom, listen to me," Elias said, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to control it. "Did they arrest you?" "No, not yet. The union rep demanded they let me go home pending the police inquiry. But Elias, if I get charged, we lose everything. I'll go to jail." "Who did this? Why is this happening?" "I know who did it," Elias said. "Go home. Lock the doors. Do not speak to the police without a lawyer. I'm coming right now." Elias hung up the phone. He walked slowly back into Diane's office. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a cold, suffocating dread. Diane looked up from the computer. She saw his face and instantly knew something had gone wrong. She stopped typing. "What happened?" "Apex Holdings," Elias said, his voice hollow. "Richard Harlan is on the board of directors for Memorial Hospital, isn't he?" Diane quickly typed the name into her database. Her face fell. "Yes, he's a platinum donor. He practically owns the executive board. Why?" "They just planted narcotics in my mother's locker," Elias said, staring blankly at the wall. "She's being investigated for felony theft. She's going to lose her nursing license. She might go to prison." The reality of the war he had started crashed down on him. This wasn't a game of legal chess anymore. Apex wasn't just trying to protect their money. They were trying to destroy his family to force him into submission. Harrington had warned him. "Remember that when the roof caves in." Diane stood up, walking around the desk and putting a hand on the teenager's shoulder. For the first time, Elias looked like what he was, a scared 17-year-old kid in way over his head. "Elias," Diane said softly, "this is how they work. This is the intimidation phase. If we file this class action tomorrow, they will fast-track your mother's criminal charges. They will bury her to break you. You need to make a choice right now. We can drop this. You can call Harrington, take the NDA, and they will make your mother's charges disappear by morning. Nobody could blame you. Elias looked at the massive binder on the desk. Inside were the names of hundreds of families. People like his mother. People who had been crushed, tossed aside, and forgotten by a system designed to exploit their lack of power. If you back down, Apex wins. Richard Harlan wins. They will keep going forever. Elias took a deep, shuddering breath. He wiped a single tear from his eye, and he looked back up at Diane. The fear was gone. It was replaced by an icy, terrifying resolve. "Ms. Montgomery," Elias said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "I don't just want to file the class action anymore." "What do you want to do?" Diane asked. "I want to pierce the corporate veil," Elias said, his eidetic mind already pulling up federal statutes, connecting dots, building a weapon of mass legal destruction. "I want to hold Richard Harlan personally, criminally liable for the fraud. I want to freeze his personal assets. I want to rip his empire down to the studs." Elias grabbed his backpack and slung it over his shoulder. "File the injunction tonight," Elias ordered, his eyes burning with a brilliant, destructive light. "Let them come for my mother, because by the time they get to court, I'm going to make sure Richard Harlan is wearing handcuffs." The next couple of days were a blur of caffeine, whiteboards, and pure, unfiltered desperation. Elias did not sleep. While Diane Montgomery drafted the sprawling civil RICO complaint, Elias sat in the corner of her office, his laptop wired directly into the router for maximum speed. He was hunting a ghost, piercing the corporate veil. Diane had explained that piercing the corporate veil is the hardest thing to do in corporate law. The entire system is built to protect the executives. To hold Richard Harlan personally responsible, you have to prove the alter ego doctrine. You have to prove that Apex Holdings isn't a real company, but just a personal weapon Harlan uses to commit fraud, and that he commingles his personal money with corporate funds to do it. Elias had absorbed the parameters instantly. He abandoned the property deeds and pivoted to the SEC's public Edgar database, hunting through years of Apex Holdings' quarterly financial filings. He was looking for anomalies, tiny inconsistencies that human auditors might miss, but an eidetic mind would flag. Meanwhile, the terror at home escalated. 2 detectives had visited the Whitaker house. Elena, acting on Diane's strict orders, refused to speak to them without her attorney present. The hospital formally terminated her. The local nursing board placed a temporary, devastating suspension on her license. Elena spent her days weeping on the living room sofa, her life's work destroyed by a single phantom phone call. Every time Elias looked at his phone and saw a text from his mother, a cold, dark fury pushed him deeper into the data. In the early hours one morning, Elias found it. "Ms. Montgomery," Elias croaked, his voice raw. Diane jerked awake at her desk, spilling a cold cup of coffee. "What? Did you find something?" Elias turned his laptop around. The screen was filled with dense spreadsheets. Apex Holdings has a rigid internal compliance division. Harrington's law firm handles the legal filings, but Apex's accounting department still has to approve the vendor payouts. Apex was paying Gerald Thompson, a suspended notary, directly for hundreds of fraudulent stamps that would trigger an internal audit. The volume is too high, so how was Thompson getting paid? "He wasn't getting paid by Apex," Elias said, a terrifying smile spreading across his exhausted face. "I tracked the notary registration numbers and cross-referenced them with municipal tax records. Thompson declared a secondary income stream from a consulting LLC called Brimstone Management. It's a shell company." "Okay, but shell companies are standard. Can you link Brimstone to Harlan?" "Not through Apex," Elias said, his eyes burning with triumph. "I went through the Cook County property tax assessments. The registered mailing address for Brimstone Management is a P.O. box, but the property tax for that P.O. box was paid via a wire transfer. I pulled the routing numbers from a publicly available municipal ledger." Elias tapped the screen, highlighting a string of digits. "Ms. Montgomery, That routing number belongs to an offshore trust in the Cayman Islands. And guess who listed that exact same offshore trust as a personal asset during his incredibly messy divorce proceedings years ago? Diane's breath hitched. She looked at the screen, then at Elias. "Richard Harlan," she whispered. "Harlan bypassed his own company's accounting department," Elias explained, his voice gaining strength. "He used his personal offshore trust to fund Brimstone Management, which in turn paid the suspended notary to rubber stamp the fraudulent evictions. He commingled personal funds to execute a criminal enterprise. We just pierced the corporate veil." Diane didn't say a word. She grabbed the phone on her desk and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. "Who are you calling at this hour?" Elias asked. "A friend," Diane said, her eyes locked on the screen. "An assistant United States attorney who has been trying to put Richard Harlan in federal prison for years, but never had the paper trail." The line clicked. "Quentin, it's Diane. Wake up. I'm handing you the biggest financial fraud case of your career on a silver platter. But I need a favor. I need you to raid a hospital." One morning, the federal district court for the Northern District of Illinois felt like a powder keg. Inside courtroom 3B, Garrett Harrington and Apex Holdings CEO Richard Harlan sat at the defense table. Harlan checked his heavy gold Rolex, visibly irritated by the sheer inconvenience of an emergency injunction hearing. At the plaintiff's table, 17-year-old Elias Whitaker sat quietly beside his mother, Elena, and their attorney, Diane Montgomery. Judge Vivian Hargrove, a federal judge renowned for her merciless efficiency, took the bench. "We are here regarding an injunction to freeze all real estate assets held by Apex Holdings pending a civil RICO lawsuit. Mr. Harrington, your response?" Harrington stood, attempting to project absolute confidence. "Your Honor, this is a baseless extortion built on cherry-picked data, compiled by a high school teenager. Furthermore, the plaintiff's mother, Mrs. Whitaker, is currently under police investigation for felony narcotics theft. We motion to dismiss this retaliatory lawsuit immediately." Harlan smirked. The leverage was supposed to break them. Instead, Diane Montgomery stood up, her smile razor-sharp. "Your Honor, if opposing counsel wishes to discuss the narcotics investigation, we welcome it. In fact, we brought a guest to weigh in." The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Assistant U.S. Attorney Quentin Ross marched down the aisle, flanked by 2 federal agents from the FBI's white-collar crime division. Harlan's smirk vanished. Harrington froze. "The Department of Justice officially filed a motion to intervene," Ross announced, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "We have just unsealed a federal indictment against Richard Harlan and Garrett Harrington for wire fraud, racketeering, and witness tampering." Chaos erupted at the defense table. Harlan stood, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple as he pointed at his lawyer. "What did you do?" "Ms. Montgomery, illuminate the court," Judge Hargrove ordered, slamming her gavel to cut through the noise. "Gladly," Diane replied. "My brilliant co-counsel, Mr. Whitaker, proved Mr. Harlan used his personal offshore trust to fund a suspended notary, definitively piercing the corporate veil. The witness tampering? That was Mr. Harrington's fatal mistake. When my client refused a massive bribe, Harrington fabricated a narcotics tip to destroy Mrs. Whitaker's life." Harrington gripped the table, shaking violently. "The hospital received an anonymous email. You can't prove anything." "Actually, we can," Diane countered coldly. "Mr. Whitaker understands data architecture. He advised the FBI to subpoena the hospital's firewall logs. He traced the digital footprint of that anonymous email. It bounced through proxy servers, but the originating MAC address belongs to the desktop computer sitting in the private office of Mr. Harrington." Silence in the courtroom was absolute. The trap snapped shut. "The hospital board has fully exonerated Elena Whitaker," Diane concluded softly. Elena collapsed against Elias, weeping tears of pure, unadulterated relief. He held her tight, his own shoulders finally dropping. "Passports to the bailiff. Both of you are remanded into federal custody," Judge Hargrove declared, signaling the agents as the FBI slapped handcuffs on the billionaire and his ruthless lawyer. Harlan locked eyes with Elias. The teenager didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He just stared back with icy, calculating resolve. In the following period, Apex Holdings filed for bankruptcy. Hundreds of families regained their stolen homes. Scholarship offers poured in from top universities, but Elias wasn't ready to leave Chicago just yet. Every afternoon, he walked into Diane Montgomery's office, sat at his desk, and began hunting for the next corporate giant. What began as a desperate mother's darkest hour became the ultimate David and Goliath story, proving that the most dangerous weapon in any courtroom isn't money. It's a brilliant, unrelenting mind. Elias didn't just save his home. He exposed a corrupt empire and saved hundreds of families from financial ruin. If this incredible story of justice, intellect, and unbreakable family loyalty inspired you, hit that like button. Share this video to remind the world that the truth can't be buried forever, and don't forget to subscribe for more true stories of brilliant underdogs beating the system.